For 16 years, a trusted nurse walked hospital halls with a dark secret, quietly killing his patients while no one could stop him. Charles Cullen may have murdered as many as 400 people, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history. But how did hospitals miss the warning signs for so long? This isn't just the story of a killer nurse in scrubs. It's about a healthcare system that failed vulnerable patients too. Today, we're going to uncover Cullen's dark past, the shocking hospital cover-ups, and the brave whistleblower nurse who literally risked her life to expose the truth. This is the horrifying true story of Charles Cullen, an angel of death, and this is the first time you're going to hear it from a registered nurse's perspective. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everyone. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Please like, subscribe, and comment down below any case suggestions that you have, and I will be sure to take a look into them. All right, everyone, let's jump into today's highly requested case. Hospitals are places that we instinctively associate with healing. The steady beeping of monitors, the competent voice of a nurse reassuring you that you're going to be in good hands. In these sterile clinical environments, life and death hang in a fragile balance, but it's nurses, us nurses, more than anyone else, who are expected to tip that scale towards life. Charles Cullen was supposed to be one of those people, acting as a guardian of that delicate line between crisis and recovery. For more than a decade and a half, Cullen violated every sacred expectation of this role. Instead of preserving life, he quietly and deliberately stole it. He poisoned the sick, and he did so methodically. He used the very tools meant to help heal, IV drips, syringe medications, and turned them into weapons. When authorities finally caught up with him in 2003, what unfolded stunned investigators. Cullen confessed to killing as many as 40 patients, but that number, horrifying as it was, only scratched the surface. Experts who reviewed his employment history, medication access logs, and patient deaths across 9 hospitals believed the real number could be closer to 400. Now that you have a good idea of what we're about to get into, I'm sure that you're thinking the same thing as me. How could this go on for so long? Why didn't anyone stop him? And who was Charles Cullen really? To understand that, we have to start at the beginning, long before the IV bags and burn units, and way before anyone knew that they had let a killer into their most vulnerable spaces. Charles Edmund Cullen was born on February 22nd, 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey, which is a town known for its working-class families and tight-knit neighborhoods. He was the youngest of 8 children born to Florence and Edmund Cullen in a large Catholic family doing their best to make ends meet. His father, Edmund, worked as a bus driver, and although it wasn't much, he did provide a steady income for his large family. When Charles was just 7 years old, though, his father died. That loss left a young widow, Florence, to raise 8 children on her own, and a void in Charles that he would later say greatly impacted him. From early on, Charles's life was defined by instability, though. The household that he grew up in was chaotic, according to him, and also emotionally empty. While most of his siblings were significantly older and found some sense of independence in their own lives, Charles remained home with a mother who was exhausted, overburdened, and grieving. He later described his childhood as completely miserable. Classmates picked on him relentlessly. He was socially awkward and quiet and small for his age, which that obviously makes you an easy target for bullies at school. At home, things weren't much better, though. He claimed that some of his older sister's boyfriends beat him up and also belittled him. Whether those accounts were exaggerated or not, there is no question that Charles Cullen grew up feeling unwanted, unprotected, and deeply alone. By age 9, that loneliness turned dark. He attempted to take himself out, if you know what I mean, at the age of 9, for the first time by ingesting chemicals that were in a toy chemistry set. The attempt failed, but it would not be his last. That early attempt was more than just a cry for attention, though. If there was one person in Charles's world who made him feel seen, it was his mother, Florence. She actually had immigrated from England after World War II, bringing with her both strength and resilience to her family. Despite everything, the widowhood, the financial struggles, and the endless responsibilities, she remained close with her youngest son. For Charles, Florence was not just a parent to him. She was his entire support system. In December of 1977, when Charles was just a senior in high school, Florence died in a car crash. She was his anchor, and in an instant, she was gone. The loss of his mother reportedly shattered him. Making things worse, the hospital didn't immediately even notify him. And then, without even consulting with the family, or at least without consulting Charles, her body was cremated. That meant that he didn't get the chance to say goodbye. So, at 18 years old, motherless and mentally struggling, Charles was left to fend for himself. His siblings were scattered, his home life was dissolved, and his emotional state was on the brink of collapse. Despite all of this, though, he graduated from West Orange High School in 1978, just a year after the accident. He was unfocused, isolated, and directionless. The world expected him to move forward, get a job, and make something of himself still. But what he really needed was help. Instead of help, though, Charles chose to enlist in the military and join the Navy. But before we move on, for those of you that saw my episode on Dr. Death or Harold Shipman, does this story not sound eerily familiar to you? They also both killed in numbers of hundreds, which is terrifying. Let me know down in the comments if you know what I'm talking about. To a lot of young men in the late 1970s, the military offered a clear path with structure, stability, and a paycheck, maybe even a way to find purpose. For Charles Cullen, the U.S. Navy was all of those things, at least in the beginning. He completed basic training and was selected for an elite role, actually, as a submariner. That meant that he had to pass rigorous psychological and aptitude tests. The Navy only selected candidates who could handle extreme pressure, confinement, and isolation for this role, all unavoidable aspects of life on a nuclear-powered submarine. He passed, and this wasn't a surprise because he was actually known to be very intelligent. Charles was stationed aboard the USS Woodrow Wilson, a ballistic missile submarine with Poseidon missiles. His rank and role were Petty Officer 3rd Class, responsible for overseeing missile systems. It was an important, high-stress role. For a while, it seemed like he had actually found his place there. But, of course, that didn't last. His crewmates found him odd, socially awkward, withdrawn, and really hard to talk to. He didn't fit in with the close-knit groups of the sailors, and once again, he became the target of bullying and hazing. The psychological strain began to build on him. And then came an incident that, in hindsight, feels like foreshadowing. One day, a superior officer walked into the control room aboard the USS Woodrow Wilson and saw something that they couldn't believe. Charles Cullen, the missile technician, was sitting at the missile control panel, not in his Navy uniform, but fully dressed in medical scrubs. Mask, gloves, surgical gown, head to toe, the full outfit, on a submarine. He offered no explanation. He just sat there in that bizarre costume as if he were about to perform surgery rather than monitor and do his job. The incident raised serious questions about his mental health, but instead of confronting those questions head on, the Navy reassigned Cullen to a less stressful role on the USS Canopus, which was a supply ship. That didn't help either. Cullen's behavior continued to deteriorate rapidly. He attempted lethal self-maneuvers multiple times, and in one alarming instance, he actually tried to sit inside a mechanical hatch, hoping to be crushed by the machinery in a desperate and terrifying act. He was hospitalized several times in Navy psychiatric wards. Each time he was evaluated, released, and then sent back to duty. But it was clear, Charles Cullen was unraveling. In March 1984, after 6 turbulent years in the Navy, they gave him a medical discharge for psychiatric reasons. He left without honors or recognition and had no lasting treatment. He was a young man now in his early 20s, cast back into the civilian world, unstable, untreated, and already beginning to slip through the cracks of the very system that he clearly needed. But please know that when I say all of this, I am talking about systemic failures here. I am not showing him any grace for the horrendous things that he will continue on to do. All right, let's go back to the story. When he returned to civilian life, Charles made a surprising choice. He enrolled in nursing school. It might seem like an odd leap from missile systems to medicine, but nursing school at Mountainside Hospital in Montclair, New Jersey, gave him something that he desperately needed: structure, goals, and a sense of status. And here's the crazy thing. He was actually good at it. He was elected president of his nursing class and graduated in 1987 with high achievements for the first time. His instructors described him as quiet but very capable and a model student. So how did all this go wrong? That same year, he got married to a woman named Adrienne Baum, and together they had 2 daughters. He landed a job in the burn unit at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, and it was a very demanding position. From the outside looking in, Charles Cullen looked like a success story. A kid from a rough childhood and a guy who stumbled in the military, now putting his life together with a new family, job, and future. But that version of the story was a complete lie. For a while, things looked stable for Charles. After years of emotional turmoil, dark attempts, and being discharged from the Navy, he seemed to have finally found his rhythm. He had a steady job as a nurse, a wife, 2 daughters, and the kind of middle-class family life that many people spend years trying to build. But behind the scenes, Cullen's life was starting to fracture once again, and it was fracturing quickly. At home, things were unraveling. His wife, Adrienne, became increasingly disturbed by his erratic behavior because she saw things that just didn't make sense, things that scared her. And she began to wonder who or what she had actually married. It wasn't just moodiness or emotional withdrawal. It was something darker and something that didn't feel safe. Adrienne would later tell authorities about a number of incidents that raised alarm bells. First, he reportedly terrorized their family pets, and she believed he had been harming their dogs. For anyone that watches true crime consistently, you already know that this is a major red flag and part of the triad. Also, at a party, she claimed that he had spiked someone's drink with lighter fluid, which is a bizarre and dangerous prank that very quickly could have turned deadly. I would like to think that as a nurse, he knew that though. And perhaps the most chilling, she said that he once burned his daughter's books in the fireplace in front of her to torture her. The man who had seemed quiet and mild-mannered in public was now very different in private, and he was becoming increasingly unpredictable, angry, and sometimes threatening. By 1993, Adrienne had seen enough. She filed for divorce and got a restraining order against him from her and her children. In her petition to the court, she didn't hold back. She said that she feared for her safety for herself and the kids, and she described her husband as, quote, very mentally ill, end quote, and provided disturbing examples of his behavior. In one instance, she said that Cullen had left their children with a babysitter for an entire week without telling her. Cullen denied these claims, though. He insisted that Adrienne was exaggerating, that she would try to make him look bad for the sake of custody. But the marriage had clearly collapsed, and what replaced it was resentment, instability, and increasing emotional volatility. And yet, amid all of the chaos, Cullen continued to work as a nurse. He kept showing up for his shifts, he kept handling medications, and no one, not his coworkers, not his supervisors, not even the state, had any idea what he was about to do. St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey is a large, well-respected hospital. It is not the kind of place that you'd expect a nurse to get away with murder, let alone multiple murders. But it was here, in June of 1988, that Charles Cullen crossed a line from which there was no turning back. That summer, Cullen was on duty when Judge John W. Yango Sr., a 72-year-old former municipal court judge, was admitted. It wasn't a life-threatening situation, though. The judge had a manageable medical condition and was expected to fully recover. But for reasons that Cullen later claimed not to remember, he made a fateful decision. He injected the judge's IV bag with lidocaine, a powerful medication that in high doses can stop the heart cold. Soon after, Judge Yango suffered a massive cardiac arrest and died. To hospital staff, it was tragic, but not unheard of, though. Older patients die in hospitals every day, sometimes unexpectedly. Nothing about Judge Yango's death screamed murder to anyone. There was no gunshot wound, no blood, no sign of struggle, just a man whose heart had given out. And Cullen? He didn't act suspicious. He didn't seem rattled. He just continued on with his shift like normal. That was the start of this dark path for him. Over the next few years, Cullen would quietly kill several more patients at St. Barnabas. He later confessed to a handful of these deaths, but the true number remains completely unknown at this time. In one of the cases that Cullen did admit to, he killed a patient with AIDS by injecting a massive dose of insulin. Giving insulin to someone that doesn't need it can be deadly, and something that us nurses have very easy access to. It was a method that he would continue to circle back to again and again. In small, medically appropriate doses, insulin is life-saving, but in large doses, especially in patients who are not diabetic, it's lethal. It causes hypoglycemia, or dangerously low blood sugar, which can lead to confusion, seizures, coma, and even death. And Cullen, a trained ICU nurse, knew exactly how much to give and how to make it look natural. This is terrifying. He could create what appeared to be a sudden tragic downturn, the kind of thing that happens in medicine all the time, something that no one would question. And because he used common drugs already circulating throughout the hospital, there were no missing pills, no unusual substances, and no glaring red flags to management or colleagues at the time. In those early years, no one suspected a crime had been committed, and certainly no one was looking for a serial killer. But he was right in front of their eyes the whole time. By the end of 1991, a few things started to stand out to St. Barnabas staff, though. There were noticeable upticks in code blues, which are emergency events where a patient suddenly crashes and requires life-saving measures, including CPR. IV fluid bags were occasionally found contaminated with drugs like insulin, something that shouldn't happen under any normal circumstance in the hospital, so the hospital then launched a quiet internal investigation. Cullen must have sensed that the walls were closing in, though. In January 1992, as the internal review was picking up steam, he quickly quit. Just like that, he walked away, so no charges were filed, and there was no formal report made, so no red flags sent up the chain. He simply left, and no one stopped him. Cullen's exit from St. Barnabas marked the beginning of a disturbing and deadly pattern that would continue for years. He would work at a hospital for months, sometimes years, and eventually things would start to go wrong. Patients would die unexpectedly. Coworkers would get uneasy. Administrators would then start to ask questions, and every time, before any real consequence could catch up to him, Cullen would quit. He'd just move on, and he'd get a new job, sometimes just days later at a new hospital with a fresh start and clean slate, and the killing would continue. After Charles Cullen left St. Barnabas in early 1992, he didn't disappear. He didn't take time off to go regroup or seek help, and the pattern that he had already established to kill, resign, repeat was just beginning to pick up speed. Over the next 10 years, Cullen would work at least 9 more medical facilities across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, leaving behind a rising body count and a disturbing pattern of suspicious deaths. But somehow, at every turn, he kept slipping through the cracks. Within 1 month of leaving St. Barnabas, Cullen was hired at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. He was quickly back at work in scrubs, administering medications, and overseeing vulnerable patients. And almost immediately, patients under his care began dying under odd circumstances. One of his known targets here was elderly women, particularly patients recovering from non-life-threatening conditions. Cullen's weapon of choice this time was digoxin. Digoxin is a cardiac medication used to treat heart conditions. In therapeutic doses, it helps to regulate your heartbeat. But in large amounts, it can cause fatal arrhythmias by pausing or disrupting your heart's rhythm, and that can turn deadly quickly. Cullen knew this, and he exploited that. Don't get me wrong, everything about today's case is upsetting, but to see that someone utilized their knowledge and skill set to help to manipulate this situation and weaponize their knowledge makes me physically sick. One of Cullen's victims at Warren Hospital was Helen Dean, and she was a 91-year-old woman recovering from breast cancer surgery. She was stable despite her age, and in fact, she was actually preparing to go home soon. But the day before her discharge, something changed. Helen told her son that a male nurse whom she didn't recognize and who was not assigned to her care that day had come into her room and injected her with something. She said that it felt strange, almost sneaky and unsettling. That nurse was Charles Cullen. Her son dismissed her story at the time. She was 91. She had just had surgery, and he thought that maybe she was just confused. The next day, Helen Dean had died unexpectedly. It was a devastating shock to her family. Her son was left to wonder, what had she seen and what had she felt? Later, her autopsy revealed that she had abnormally high levels of digoxin in her system. The evidence pointed directly at Cullen, but not with enough clarity to bring charges. There was no direct witness, no surveillance footage, just suspicion and a terrible outcome. Warren Hospital launched a limited investigation, and prosecutors did take a look into it. In 1993, Cullen was given a polygraph test regarding Helen's death. Somehow, he passed it, which is terrifying. And with no hard proof, the case stalled. Rather than digging deeper or escalating the matter, the hospital quietly encouraged Cullen to resign in the spring of 1993. He walked away again without consequences. While Cullen's crimes inside the hospital were deadly and deliberate, his behavior outside the hospital was becoming harder to ignore also. In March of 1993, he broke into a coworker's home while she and her young son were asleep upstairs. He didn't hurt them. He didn't steal anything. He just stood there, uninvited, inside their home and left. Creepy. Then he started stalking her. He followed her, he watched her, he made her feel unsafe in her own neighborhood. She reported him to the police, and Cullen was arrested for trespassing and later pled guilty. And then, like clockwork, he attempted to take himself out again, just a day later. It was a pattern that investigators would eventually recognize clearly. When Cullen got too close to being exposed or caught, or when his life began to spiral again, his instinct was to self-destruct. He was briefly institutionalized for depression, but only for a short period. And then he was right back on the job market looking for another nursing position. In 1994, Cullen landed his next role in a position in the intensive care unit, or ICU, at Hunterdon Medical Center. Once again, he was entrusted with critically ill patients, and his access to medications was broad. And once again, Cullen seemed, on the surface, like a competent but slightly odd nurse. For a while, nothing raised alarms. Cullen later claimed that for the first 2 years at Hunterdon, he didn't kill anyone. Now, whether that's true or not is up for debate. And unfortunately, the hospital's record keeping during those years was not good. By the time investigators would revisit the facility years later, many documents had been lost or destroyed. What is clear, though, is that by 1996, Cullen was killing again. In that year alone, Cullen admitted to murdering at least 5 patients at Hunterdon, all through digoxin overdoses. These weren't terminal patients. They were recovering, stable, or improving. In some cases, they were days away from being discharged, but something that I want to add here is a little insight as a nurse that has worked in critical care before too. Now, every nurse has specific room or patient assignments during our shifts. We get to know and are responsible for our patients while under our care. So when one of our patients suddenly codes or passes away, we are at the helm of it and trying to figure out why or how this happened. Something that really concerns me about this level of evil here is that Charles Cullen was not doing this to his own patients most of the time. It seems that he was often doing this to other nurses' patients. That is manipulative and evil. His strategy made it difficult to trace back to him because he snuck into rooms and killed under the radar. I can only imagine the level of betrayal that the nurses felt as they were fighting so hard to save their patients' lives, not knowing that at the time one of their own was trying to kill them. Some of the names that were shared later on in the investigation were 71-year-old Leroy Sin, 76-year-old Earl Young, 49-year-old Catherine Dext, 66-year-old Frank Mazzacco, and 81-year-old Jesse Eichlin. Each of these victims were a parent, a grandparent, or a spouse. Each was a human being whose life ended not because of illness, but because of the man wearing the nurse's badge. Once again, no one at the hospital connected these dots in real time, though. The deaths seemed explainable. These were elderly patients with pre-existing conditions. Cardiac events are not uncommon in the ICU. After leaving Hunterdon, Cullen took a job at Morristown Memorial Hospital, but this didn't last long either. Unlike his prior jobs, this time he was fired, but not for suspected patient harm, but for poor performance. Surprisingly, it was a rare moment where a hospital actually terminated Cullen instead of letting him resign quietly. Still, no one reported him to the State Board of Nursing, and no formal complaints were filed, so nothing showed up on any kind of background check for him. In February of 1998, Cullen found a new job, this time at a nursing home in Allentown, Pennsylvania, called Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center. This facility cared for highly vulnerable patients, including many who were respirator dependent, meaning that these people literally could not breathe without these machines, so us nurses need to take care of them. Within weeks, staff members began noticing odd behavior. Cullen was entering patients' rooms at unusual times, often carrying syringes when no medications were scheduled to be given at that time. In one case, a patient was found with a broken arm shortly after Cullen had been alone with them, which could be a sign of possible struggle. Coworkers also reported that Cullen had a habit of giving out medications at unscheduled times, and that is a clear violation of medical protocol. Eventually, Liberty fired him also for misconduct. They never officially tied him to any deaths, but later investigations suggest that he actually caused at least one patient's death at Liberty, and this was a death that was wrongly blamed on another nurse at the time. Again, no criminal charges were filed, no report to the state boards, just a quiet firing so Cullen could move on and continue this dark pattern. Just months later, in November of 1998, Cullen got a new job at Easton Hospital in Easton, Pennsylvania. And by December 30th, a patient named Audemars Schramm died suddenly without any logical reason. Blood tests after his death revealed a lethal level of digoxin in his system, which was a huge red flag because this was not a therapeutic dose. It was fatal. Cullen had been one of the nurses caring for him and actually assigned to his care at this time. An internal inquiry was launched, and suspicion immediately fell on Cullen. But once again, administrators couldn't pin it on him conclusively. There was no smoking gun, and Cullen denied everything. So, surprise, surprise, no charges were filed, therefore, no disciplinary action could be taken. And Cullen continued to work there until March of 1999. At this point, had anyone stepped back and looked at the full picture, they would have seen a pattern of moving between a string of hospitals tied to suspicious deaths, a nurse who kept being asked to leave, and a man who had been arrested for stalking. He also had been hospitalized for multiple self attempts and fired repeatedly for odd behavior, all major red flags when put together. But no such system existed to connect these dots, and each hospital only saw a sliver of Cullen's past. Each resignation was handled quietly, and each internal suspicion was hushed. So Cullen's killing spree continued on. By the time Charles Cullen began working at Lehigh Valley Hospital in Allentown, Pennsylvania in March of 1999, he was no longer just an unstable nurse with a troubling past. He was a man fully comfortable with murder. And terrifyingly, he'd gotten better at hiding it. Lehigh Valley was a prestigious institution and known to be one of the best in the region. With state-of-the-art facilities and a staff of highly trained professionals, this wasn't some underfunded corner hospital. This was a place with resources, oversight, and reputation to protect. And yet none of that mattered because Cullen knew how to exploit these cracks in the system. And once he was in, clean resume, quiet demeanor, no official red flags, he went right back to work and right back to killing. At Lehigh Valley, Cullen worked night shifts in the cardiac care unit. That gave him access to the most vulnerable patients with those heart conditions, breathing issues, and fragile postoperative recoveries. This setting would be the exact environment that would allow his heinous acts to continue on because it also gave him freedom. On night shift, there were fewer administrators and less supervision. This was a perfect environment for a killer who liked to operate quietly and invisibly. During this time at Lehigh Valley, Cullen began fine-tuning his method even further. He leaned heavily on digoxin, his preferred poison, but he also began to use lidocaine, which is a medication typically used as a local anesthetic or antiarrhythmic drug. For those of you that don't know, an antiarrhythmic medication actually helps to fix abnormal heartbeats and rhythms. In high doses, lidocaine can interfere with the heart's electrical pathways, leading to deadly arrhythmias or deadly heart rhythms. It's difficult to detect postmortem, especially in patients already battling cardiac conditions or those that are already on the medication because it's supposed to be in their system. Cullen knew this. He knew which drugs were fatal, which ones would metabolize or leave the body quickly, and which would leave minimal traces. He also knew how to manipulate electronic medication systems, sometimes removing drugs, then canceling the order, leaving a false trail in the logs to cover his tracks. He wasn't just acting on impulse anymore. All of his actions were methodical, controlled, and calculated. It's unclear how many people he killed at Lehigh Valley, but he later confessed to at least 5 murders during his time there. But investigators believe the true number was much higher. Among the victims were a man named Jay Kralik. He was a 52-year-old man who had just undergone surgery and was expected to fully recover. He died after a sudden, unexplained cardiac event. James Tarver was a 64-year-old man who died under Cullen's watch as well. His death raised no suspicion at the time either. Patients who were stable suddenly began coding, entering life-threatening cardiac arrests without any clear cause. Some were revived and some were not so lucky. Staff members noticed the strange pattern though. But suspicion is one thing and proof is another. Charles always had plausible explanations. He always charted cleanly, and if someone asked him too many questions, he would just quit again, which is exactly what he did. In June of 2000, Cullen left Lehigh Valley and took on a new job at St. Luke's Hospital in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Once again, the cycle repeated. A new hospital, fresh start, and with no consequences. He worked in the cardiac telemetry unit, which monitored patients with, again, heart issues, and this was another position that he would continue to have access to these high-risk medications and vulnerable people. Here, Cullen would later admit to killing at least 5 additional people. Once again, the stories were heartbreakingly similar. Patients recovering well were suddenly dead. Patients with stable heart rhythms were replaced by fatal problems. And nurses were walking into rooms to find patients unresponsive, with their monitors blaring. In hindsight, it was obvious that something was terribly wrong. But in real time, everything looked like bad luck or coincidence, and I can tell you that the way that he went about this would absolutely make it difficult to detect, until it happened one too many times. At St. Luke's, some nurses finally began asking questions. They noticed Cullen's name on more code blue events than seemed statistically likely. They saw him accessing medications for patients not under his care, and they even brought their concerns to hospital administrators. And to their credit, St. Luke's didn't ignore them. They opened an internal investigation, and what they found deeply concerned them. Cullen had been sneaking medications from the hospital's Pyxis system. Pyxis is the machine that contains locked away medications, in case you weren't aware. He had been logging into charts, and he had no reason to be in them. And he had been present for an unusually high number of patient deaths. St. Luke's gave him an ultimatum: resign or be fired. Cullen chose to resign, but in a rare move, the hospital actually contacted law enforcement this time. By the time that the case made it to prosecutors, the evidence wasn't enough, though. There was no hard forensic links between Charles and the patient's deaths, so no charges were filed. So Charles Cullen once again walked free. Let's pause here for a second. By this point, Charles Cullen had worked at 7 hospitals, been connected to multiple patient deaths, was investigated internally at least 2 facilities, and coworkers were openly expressing fear and concerns about him. He had also been arrested for stalking, was institutionalized for multiple attempts, and had been suspected of killing people by a growing number of healthcare professionals. And still, he had an active nursing license and found a way to get hired again. No criminal charges could stick. The cracks in this system had been turning into the Grand Canyon by this point, and Charles Cullen, who had killed dozens of people, was about to enter into a new hospital, one that would become his deadliest yet. In September 2002, Cullen was hired by Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, and this was a well-regarded hospital that, like the others, had no idea who they just let in. He was placed in the critical care unit working nights. The killings began almost immediately, and they never stopped. Over the next year, at least 13 patients died at Somerset under Cullen's care, possibly more, and this time it wasn't going to go unnoticed. Among the victims were Reverend Florian Gall, who had been recovering well until he suddenly died from a digoxin overdose. James Strickland and Edward Zizik were all older patients who died from unexplained insulin overdoses or cardiac arrests. One patient, Frances Agodata, survived an attempted poisoning. Her blood sugar dropped dangerously, but she was revived in time. It was the kind of error that would later provide investigators with a smoking gun. Behind the scenes, though, hospital pharmacists began noticing troubling patterns because medication records weren't adding up anymore. The pharmacists are the ones that actually track and trend what's being pulled from the Pyxis, so I am so glad that someone finally was catching on. Cullen was pulling medications like digoxin and insulin when he had no medical reason to. They reported their concerns internally, but it took months, yes, months, before anyone acted. Finally, in October of 2003, after yet another suspicious death, a pharmacist at Somerset contacted Dr. Stephen Marcus, the head of the New Jersey Poison Control Center. Dr. Marcus reviewed the cases and immediately recognized the signs. This wasn't an error. This was intentional, and someone had been murdering patients. He begged the hospital to call the police immediately, and it would take another month before they did so. In November 2003, 2 detectives, Tim Braun and Danny Baldwin from the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office, were assigned to investigate the suspicious deaths at Somerset Medical Center. What they found horrified them. Cullen's medication logs, once retrieved in full, showed that he had accessed powerful drugs dozens of times, oftentimes for patients who didn't need them or who weren't even under his care. They learned about his history at other hospitals, about the stalking arrest, and they finally saw what others had missed: a serial killer hiding in plain sight. But they didn't have enough to arrest him still. They needed help. Thankfully, they were about to get it from someone who knew Cullen better than almost anyone on the planet. By the fall of 2003, everything was beginning to close in on Charles Cullen. He didn't know it yet, but the quiet walls that he had built around his crimes with his calm exterior, the fake competence, and the clean medical charts were all crumbling. The detectives now had access to medication logs from Somerset Medical Center. They had a suspect, they had a timeline, but what they didn't have yet was proof. They needed a witness, someone on the inside to help them understand how Cullen had done it and maybe even get close enough to hear him say it himself. The key to his downfall was a woman named Amy Logren, a nurse, a single mom, and according to all the staff there, one of the most compassionate people on the floor. She was also one of Charles Cullen's closest friends. Amy Logren had been working with Charles Cullen at Somerset for over a year at this point. She was actually struggling with her own health issues at the time. She had a heart condition that actually required her to work nights so that she could stay on insurance and get the treatment that she needed. Cullen was there for her. He was kind, soft-spoken, and generous for some strange reason. When she had fainting spells or needed to catch her breath between patients, he'd always be there for her and cover for her. He'd sit with her during slow shifts, and they'd share stories and laugh and vent about work. She really trusted him. When detectives Tim Braun and Danny Baldwin reached out to her and said, quote, "We think Charles Cullen might be killing patients," unquote, she was shocked. She later said that she thought the investigators were literally out of their minds, but then they showed her the evidence because they needed to earn her trust somehow. The detectives didn't just hand her theories, they handed her the data. She saw Cullen's access logs, the records of medications that he had been pulling, the times he had withdrawn insulin or digoxin for the patients that he wasn't even assigned to, the names, the timestamps, the pattern. It didn't make any sense to her because Amy knew how the unit worked. She knew which meds were dangerous, and she knew that there was no clinical reason for Cullen to be doing what he was doing by the records. She went home that night and cried. She made a decision. She would help the detectives, even if it meant betraying someone that she cared about, even if that meant that she was putting herself and possibly her children at risk by participating in this. In December of 2003, Amy Logren met with police and agreed to wear a wire. She met with Cullen casually, like she always did, and tried to get him to talk. The goal was to get him to say something, anything, that could help investigators make an arrest. At first, the conversations were really unusual and guarded. Cullen was suspicious, and Amy wasn't pushing too hard, thankfully. She knew how to talk to him and how to guide him softly towards the edge. In their final meeting, Cullen began to crack. He didn't confess outright, but he said things that couldn't be walked back anymore. He had admitted that he had been accessing medications, quote, for other patients, end quote. He talked about wanting to end their suffering. He hinted that what he had done could not be undone. That was enough for investigators. On December 12, 2003, Charles Cullen was arrested at a diner in Somerset County. The man who had been quietly murdering for over 16 years, who had worked at 10 hospitals, slipped past dozens of administrators, and killed as many as 400 people, was finally in custody. What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in American criminal history. Cullen didn't fight. He didn't deny any of it. He didn't even seem particularly nervous. In the taped interviews with prosecutors and detectives, he sat calmly and explained what he had done almost clinically, as if he was just reading off a to-do list. He confessed to 29 murders across 6 hospitals. Later, that number would grow to 40. And even then, he admitted that he didn't know all of the names because he had killed so many people that he had forgotten some of them. When asked why he had murdered all those people, Cullen repeated a version of what he had said for years, quote, "I thought I was helping," end quote. He claimed that he didn't want patients to go through the trauma of being coded, of being shocked and resuscitated, suffering through prolonged hopeless illness. But the details of his victims' cases don't back that up. Many were not dying. Some were actually getting better. Some were already scheduled to be discharged home. Some, like 21-year-old Mike Stranko, were just starting their adult lives, and others, like Helen Dean, had just beaten cancer. Cullen was not a mercy killer. He was a man who had grown addicted to the power of stealing lives, and he had learned that in the hospital system, no one could stop him. After his arrest, prosecutors faced a critical decision. They could charge Cullen with dozens of counts of murder, possibly seek the death penalty, and risk him shutting down and refusing to cooperate. Or they could offer him a deal. In April 2004, Cullen agreed to a plea bargain. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he would fully cooperate by naming victims, describing methods, and providing testimony when needed. Cullen sat for hours with investigators, methodically walking through his past: hospitals, dates, names, drugs. In 2006, he pleaded guilty to 22 murders in New Jersey. Between 2006 and 2007, he pleaded to 7 more in Pennsylvania. And in total, he confessed to 29 murders, but nearly every expert and Cullen himself agrees that the true number is in the hundreds, much, much higher. At his sentencing in March of 2006, Cullen showed zero emotion. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms in prison without any chance of parole. He sat in a bulletproof vest, silent and blank. When the families of his victims were given a chance to speak, they unleashed their grief one by one, and they stood up and addressed him directly. Cullen stared straight ahead. When asked if he had anything to say, he responded only once, repeating the same phrase over and over in a robotic voice, quote, "Your Honor, you need to step down," end quote. Over and over and over, until the judge ordered him to be removed from the courtroom. Let me know your thoughts on that weird phrase because I'm seriously confused by it. What did he mean by telling the judge to step down? Is that him feeling superior to the judge, or is he saying that the judge should step down for allowing him to strike a plea deal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Charles Cullen is currently serving his life sentence at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, which is a maximum security facility. He lives in isolation without internet and has had no visitors, just books, concrete walls, and the ghosts of hundreds of patients that he took. He will never be released. By the time the headlines called Charles Cullen the Angel of Death, it was already too late for so many. He wasn't the stuff of horror movies. No mask, no axe, no shadowy figure lurking in the dark. He wore scrubs. He walked calmly through hallways. He checked charts. He spoke softly. He gave medications, and then patients died. It's easy in stories like this to focus on him, the killer, the psychology, the timeline, the arrest. But the truth is, Charles Cullen's story is not just about him. It's about the victims, the families, and the lives stolen in moments that should have been safe. Their families had hope. They brought flowers, they made plans, then Charles Cullen walked into their rooms and hope died. Even more horrifying than what Cullen did is the way so many institutions helped him to get away with it. Not out of malice, but out of bureaucracy, fear, and silence. Over 16 years, Cullen worked at 10 different hospitals. Multiple facilities had suspected him, and some investigated. Some even fired him. Some gave him glowing references just to get rid of him. But not one hospital alerted the State Board of Nursing or even filed a formal complaint until the very end. The reasons? They vary, but likely from fear of lawsuits, reputation management, lack of communication between institutions, and no centralized database of disciplinary actions. Long story short, the system drastically failed. Cullen didn't get away with murder because he was clever. He got away with it because the healthcare system was not built to stop someone like him. After Cullen's arrest and sentencing, the story caught national and international attention, and one person emerged as a true hero. Amy Logren, the nurse who wore the wire that brought him down. Her bravery became the focus of Charles Graeber's acclaimed book, The Good Nurse, a true story of medicine, madness, and murder, published in 2013, and I did read some of it. Very, very good book. You should read it. The book offered a deeply researched human look into Cullen's crimes and into the woman who helped stop them. In 2022, Netflix released a dramatized version of the story, also called The Good Nurse, which if you haven't seen it, definitely give it a watch. The film reignited public outrage and brought renewed attention to the story. In the wake of Cullen's conviction, several hospitals conducted internal reviews. Some improved reporting policies, and a few states enhanced protection for whistleblowers. But the healthcare industry, especially in the US, still suffers from fragmented systems between states and hospitals, inconsistent reporting on disciplinary action, financial incentives to quietly remove problem staff, and fear of liability overriding transparency. They also suffer from limited background checks that don't account for internal suspicions. To this day, a medical professional can resign quietly from one hospital and easily find work at another, oftentimes without any red flags. To be completely honest with you guys, I have seen nurses show extremely concerning behaviors and be fired only to be hired again without any problem at the next location. It truly is a problem that I hope to see hospitals someday rectify. That's the very loophole that Charles Cullen exploited, though, and it still isn't completely closed. For the families left behind, the pain didn't end with Cullen's arrest. In many cases, it had only just begun. Some didn't even know that their loved ones had been murdered until many years later when Cullen confessed it. They had to relive their grief now. Only this time, it was not grieving because of a traditional death. It was grieving a loss from murder. And this was betrayal, not just by one man, but by the hospitals that they trusted to take care of their family. Many of them have become advocates, pushing for stronger protections, more transparency, and a healthcare system that listens when nurses say something is wrong. Their fight continues, though. Some psychologists have speculated about what truly drove Cullen to become the most notorious serial killer in American history. He claimed that he wanted to end victims' suffering, but his victims' medical records directly contradicted that. He claimed that he had no sexual or dark motive, but the control that he exerted potentially suggests otherwise. He admitted that he sometimes chose victims at random, but one thing is clear: Cullen was mentally ill. He attempted to go over 20 times, was hospitalized for depression, and he had even heard voices at one point, reportedly. But mental illness does not explain nor excuse his actions. There are thousands of nurses living with mental health struggles to this day who do not harm others. What Cullen did was evil, no matter how softly he spoke or how sick he had claimed to be. And the system made it easy for him. Charles Cullen is 65 years old and remains incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison under multiple life sentences with no chance to see daylight ever again. Hospitals are sacred spaces. When you walk into one, you surrender control. You let strangers poke and prod, inject and sedate, operate and intubate, and you do it because you trust that the people there in scrubs are there to help you. Most of us are. Cullen took that trust and turned it into a weapon. He didn't just kill people. He broke something fundamental in the way that we see caregivers. Please know that the vast majority of us in healthcare truly are here to serve, care for you, and advocate for you. This man is an utter embarrassment to the nursing profession, and I hope that he is haunted by the ghosts and decisions that he made every day for the rest of his life. You all know that I like to share more about the victims, and in today's story, there's such a large volume of them that I think that you'd be sick of me by the time we went over each and every one. So for now, I want to say that I wish the hundreds of people's lives that he stole are resting peacefully, and I am sending love to their loved ones too. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I am so unbelievably grateful for each and every one of you. You have no idea. Please take extra great care of yourselves this week. Nurse's orders. Oh, and don't forget to drop me a blue butterfly as our secret handshake per usual. I'll see you next week, you guys. Bye.